The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Annelise Orleck, who's a professor of history at Dartmouth College and the author, most recently, of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise Orleck, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Your book is a remarkable account of low-wage workers across the globe. How did you do your research?
I did my research in all kinds of ways. Interestingly, one of the ways that I found people was the same way that this new movement has found each other, and that is social media. I began to look for references about strikes and uprisings and new kinds of protests as part of this rising global labor movement. And I Facebooked people, I texted them, I Twittered and reached out all of those ways, and in so doing was able to make contact with people from South Africa to Baja California to Providence, Rhode Island. After that, we traveled around the world. I traveled with photographer Elizabeth Cook, who did original photographs for this project, and we did interviews in union halls. We did them in the midst of protests in the streets. We did them in faded old colonial hotels. We interviewed people by phone, by Skype, in person, and in many, many languages. And, we traveled on planes and buses, but also in open-air tuk-tuks in Asia on the backs of motorcycles. It was a pretty adventurous research process.
Wow. That actually sounds like a lot of fun on top of everything else, just to have that type of experience. And across this expansive stretch of experience, what kind of similarities did you see in the way that low-income work affects people's lives?
Well, one thing that became clear is that there have been some larger changes that have happened as a result of neoliberal capitalism in the last 30, 40 years. So here are the issues. Everywhere I went, people were protesting what they called contractualization, or what we call the gig economy. And what that means is that nobody's an employee anymore. Everybody's a contract worker. We are all fast food workers. What does that mean? 100 years ago and into the middle of the 20th century, most countries passed labor laws protecting workers, maximum hours, overtime pay, safety standards. By making everybody an independent contractor instead of an employee, corporations have done kind of an end run around labor protections for workers. So that's one thing. They're having to fight to win back the rights that workers fought for and won in the early 20th century. The next thing is that there's a real fight against the abuse of workers on the shop floor. Most low-wage workers are women, and so everywhere I went, they were fighting sexual violence in the workplace, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination. They were fighting for wage equity between male and female workers. So, there's that piece of it that to a large degree, although by no means exclusively, this has been a women's movement. And, finally, there's a real race to the bottom. What global capitalism means is that, for example, workers in Cambodia told me they were constantly threatened with the factories just picking up and leaving and moving to Bangladesh, right? They said employers would say, if you insist on higher wages, we'll just, close up shop and move someplace else where it's cheaper. And interestingly, now that Bangladeshi workers have been organizing so effectively since 2010, 2010, and they've raised their wages by many times, and they've been able to get hundreds of global corporations to agree to something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which mandates factory safety inspections and mandates that the global brands actually make repairs on the factories where they make their clothing. Since that time, we've gotten, this expansion even further. And so, there've been recent reports on how Ethiopia has become, the new fast fashion engine, because there are not the kinds of labor protections there that there are other places, but they're organizing there too. And finally, the one other thing that's really unites workers worldwide is they work for the same corporations. So, many of these workers, garment workers around the world are all making clothes for H&M, for Walmart, for Gap, for Zara. And, as far as fast food workers, McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the world. Walmart is the first, right? And so they've begun to organize together with workers who work for the same global corporations, because they realize that the only way to make a difference, to be felt, when you protest against such global behemoths, is to organize transnationally, and that's exactly what they've been doing.
Interesting. Well, and of course, the thread that holds this together in your book is the impact of global capitalism. What did you learn that you didn't already know about global capitalism in writing this book?
Well, one of the things that really struck me is, I've been politically observant all my life, and I'm a political historian. It's what I do for a living. And yet I was really struck by the extent to which these changes took place in my adult life, and I missed them, right? I did not see it. And so I think one of the things that really struck me is that we've had the emergence of these global corporations and global supply chains that are so complicated that one of the first things workers have to do when they organize is figure out who they're working for, because they know they're not really working for the farmer in whose fields they labor, or even the garment factory owner in whose shop they make hundreds of shirts or pairs of sneakers or jeans in a day. Who they're really working for are the global brands, and the global brands intentionally make their supply chains complicated so that it's really difficult to trace who has the real power in these global supply chains. That's intentional, and also so they have plausible deniability. So Kalpana Akhtar, who's the leader of the Bangladesh garment workers movement, has talked about having to go in after factory fires in Dhaka and literally put her fingers in the still hot rubble and find invoices and labels so that she can then go to a Walmart or a Children's Place in the United States and say, you were there, because these corporations deny it. Of course they deny it. They don't want to have to pay reparations. They don't want to be sued. And so that's been, for me, really a surprise, is how much this process has been about making the invisible visible. For hotels, it's the same thing, right? We think of all these global hotel chains as being run, by one corporation, but in fact, hotel chains have become this site for equity investment firms. Capital goes in and out, and the people who really run them are these hotel management firms. And, the people who clean hotel rooms are maybe the most invisible of all workers, right? We all imagine, as organizer Massimo Frattini in Geneva said to me, we all imagine that we leave the hotel room and a ferry comes in and makes it beautiful again by the time we come back that evening. Of course, it's real people. It's very, very hard on people's bodies. And so they've really worked to make themselves visible, and including some very creative kinds of protests. For example, a bed-making demonstration in Harvard Square when the workers of the Doubletree Harvard Square were trying to organize, and they wanted to get, people in the college to pay attention to them. They had to come out of the rooms, out of the hotels, into the street, and literally help people try to make beds the way they have to make, 20, 30 beds a day, so that people could see how punishing it is on their bodies. So I think this making the invisible visible has been really important. The field workers who pick tomatoes are currently fasting in front of the United Nations in New York because, they're trying to bring attention to sexual harassment and sexual violence in the fields. So again and again, these low-wage workers have had to fight their own invisibility, and that is really surprising and moving to me.
We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, another link you find across the globe is that of resistance. You touched on a little bit of it right there. You write about small successes that can be models for change. So what are some of those small successes that we need to know about?
Well, there are three things going on right now that I think are really important. The first is that out of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is one of the most creative progressive think tanks in the country, came a new organization called Jobs to Move America. And the idea was that you can take advantage of procurement budgets that cities have because cities spend a lot of money on things like mass transport, buses, trains, trucks. And so this organization has forged agreements with Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, and in so doing have brought unionized heavy manufacturing back to those cities. And what they were able to negotiate is that the cities would agree, the city departments of transportation would agree to enforce in the contract bids, to give the contract bids to companies that agreed to A, make a sizable percentage, produce a sizable percentage of the trains, buses, trucks, in the city or right near the city, B, that they would be produced in an environmentally sensitive way and would be environmentally cutting-edge vehicles, and third, that they would be union jobs, and fourth, and that the unions would train workers for those jobs. Fourth, the people who would be trained would often be people who had really big obstacles in the way of their employment. So, women of color, former vets, former cons, people who have a really hard time finding work. And so it's very exciting. You've got trains being made on the south side of Chicago again. You've got really depressed areas outside of LA where electric trucks are being made. And they're being made through these kinds of contracts. So that's one model that I think is really important because there was so much rhetoric in the 2016 campaign about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, to cities in the U.S. This progressive organization in Los Angeles is doing it, and they're doing it in really positive, environmentally friendly ways, gender equitable ways. I think that's a very exciting model. Here are a couple of others. The Villa Altagracia project makes logo wear clothing for 800 colleges and universities in the United States. This was a town in the Dominican Republic where there were these garment factories owned by foreign capital, in that case, Korean, I believe. And the workers had been trying to unionize for years, and they traveled to the United States. They made common cause with United Students Against Sweatshops, and consumers supported them, and eventually they were allowed to organize, to unionize. But then, as so often has happened in this new system, global capital fled, and the factory shut down, the town withered. Well, this guy, Phil Knight of Knight's Apparel, which makes uniforms for the National Hockey League, had a lot of tragedies in his family, and he said it made him come up and think about himself and what he is doing with his life besides making money. And he decided to open up a test project called the Villa Altagracia Project. And these are factories, garment factories with union jobs. Workers have health care. They're now people who are living in huts are living in houses with running water and electricity. Their kids get help trying to go to college. And this corporate, this responsible corporation is now, they partnered with United Students Against Sweatshops on these various campuses, and they partnered with Barnes & Noble, which runs a lot of campus bookstores, to create this label. Right, so that when students go in and buy logo wear for these 800 colleges, they know that it's being made in a humane way by union workers under safe conditions. And so I think Villa Altagracia is really an example of something that could be scaled up. Right, if a relatively small clothing manufacturer could make a profit doing it, and they've just started to make a profit. They had to go a few years without. Then I think this is really a model that can be scaled up. And then I think another Another success is there are a couple of different kinds. One of these workers' cooperatives, producers' cooperatives all over the country and the world. I visited some grape co-ops in South Africa where people are growing grapes in the townships. And I think for berries, there's a really interesting farm in California called the Swanton Berry Farm, which is both unionized and organic. And they are part of a project that tries to bring union organic grown produce for sale in poor districts of their state, right, for sale for affordable rates. Workers are paid in part in shares of the company so that when they leave, they'll be able to retire. As a result, they stay on these berry farms for a really long time. And, it's one of the most stable workforces in agriculture. And so I think there are a lot of these kind of small successes that I think we need to look at. There are some zero-waste garment companies because fashion is a very dirty industry. There's a whole lot of going on that I think people should know about. And the final thing, maybe the biggest, is something called worker-led social responsibility codes. A lot of corporations have corporate social responsibility codes. They're worth only so much. But these worker-led codes that were pioneered by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida and that have come to turn the Florida tomato fields from the worst agricultural workplaces in the country to the very best, is now being used by Vermont dairy workers. They just got Ben and Jerry's to sign on. And what it is the big buyer at the top of the supply chain, Ben and Jerry's or Taco Bell, who buys the most tomatoes, or H&M, who buys the most clothes. They agree that they will pay a little bit more from their suppliers for a premium product, that this extra money will also help to pay for outside safety inspections, and to negotiate grievances around sexual assault and violence, and to fight slavery, labor slavery in these workplaces. This, to me, is one of the most promising new strategies, and I think it's taking over and is one way that we're going to see, really different kinds of conditions and wages around the world.
Well, and those are all of those are wonderful examples. And the one thing I think is really important to point out is that you just gave examples of both small companies and large corporations that can make this happen. So I think that's a very, very positive sign indeed. As we listen to Donald Trump, Annelise, talk about tearing up trade deals and imposing tariffs, what does that mean for low-wage workers?
I think that there is no question that trade agreements like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership had devastating effects on low-wage workers. I mean, what NAFTA did to small farmers in Mexico, as well as to American manufacturing workers, on the northern side of the border, was devastating. The thing is that the ways in which Donald Trump is going about, rethinking these trade deals has nothing to do with benefiting workers, right? These tariffs are, not thought through. They are, as is always the case with every economic policy that he comes up with, they're packaged to sound like they benefit workers when in fact they benefit corporations. I think if you really wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and there are all kinds of reasons that you should, for environmental disasters, for the preservation of, the diversity of corn crops in a state like Oaxaca in Mexico, which have been devastated by GMO American corn and as it flooded into the country after NAFTA. If you want to renegotiate, then you've got to put the right kinds of stakeholders at the table. It's not something you can just rattle off at the end of a at the end of a meeting with manufacturers in answer to a quickly asked question by the press. So do we need a new trade regime? Absolutely. But I think we need one that is not geared toward destroying organized labor. We need a vision much more like the Franklin Roosevelt vision, in which you had labor, manufacturers, and consumers together at the table. I'm not saying that regime was perfect by any stretch, but that's the kind of vision and structure that you would need to renegotiate the trade deals that have devastated our world in the last 30, 40 years. And I do agree that there's been tremendous damage as a result of the World Trade Organization tribunals and the loan policies and project policies of the World Bank and the IMF. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump's tariffs are not the answer.
Right. Well, and it's also, if fix it if it's broken. You don't necessarily have to throw out the entire thing. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College, author most recently of "We Are All Fast Food Workers Now: The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages." Annelise, in another interview that you did on this book, you said this about the people you interviewed, quote, "They taught me that our inward-looking grief after the election of Donald Trump was a sign of our privilege, that we have to keep on fighting no matter what." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed people who were, rising up and going into the streets, after Rodrigo Duterte was elected in the Philippines. The tremendous courage that it takes to go up against someone who, will shoot you as soon as look at you, really, really stunned me. And a lot of these are very young people, and one of them even said to me, we're too young. We can't afford to be afraid, right? This is, the movement is my life, she said. It's my music, it's my rhythm, and you can give me 1,000 reasons to leave it, and I will give you 1,000,000 why I have to stay on. I spoke to a 27-year-old activist and organizer of hotel and casino workers in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And, going up against the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia is no joke either, as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, and also a man very willing to use violence to preserve his hold on power. He has, and he will. And she said, I know I could die. I know I could die in this struggle. She said, but that's okay. She said, it really is. I'm not just saying that. It's really okay if I could begin to bring change. And another organizer there said to me, after the Phnom Penh, we deserve a real democracy, and we will put our lives on the line for it. So I think that in meeting with these workers, I think in watching the workers, the 50,000 or more who went on strike in Baja California, the berry pickers, some of the poorest workers in the world, and who shut down that Trans-Pacific Highway from Baja into California, where the berries get shipped into the United States. Their bravery is tremendous. Again, they're beaten by police, shot at, and I think that their insistence on continuing the struggle is a real lesson to all of us here in the United States. And I think also that African American and Latinx organizers here in the United States also, especially undocumented workers and organizers, really also put in perspective our grief about the Trump election. I spoke to a 21-year-old organizer and activist, an African American guy in Las Vegas, Stretch Sanders, who said to me, this was the day after the election. He said, I'm scared. But he said, I'm not that scared. My brothers and sisters were already being shut down in the streets by police who should know better. My undocumented coworkers were already having knocks on the door, and families were already being broken up with parents taken with their kids, didn't know where they could find them. He said, this struggle's been going on a long time, and we can't stop now. So all of those people gave me hope, and they gave me strength, and I just try to live up to their courage.
So you just mentioned hope, and you have said in the past this book left you with a feeling of hope. Why hope?
Well, because they've achieved a tremendous amount in a very short time. So for 40 years, wages have been stagnating, and in fact, the real buying power of wages has been dropping precipitously. But since 2012, workers just in the United States, low-wage workers, have through passing local and state legislation, through getting private corporations to agree as a result of their protests to raise the minimum wage, have won $61.5 billion in wage raises in just 4 years, right? That is 12 times the raise that Congress gave low-wage workers the last time it raised the federal minimum wage in 2007. It went into effect in 2009. You've had wage increases. Wages have increased by many times all over the world, in South Africa, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in Mexico. So wage increases are happening, and the only reason they're happening is because of this vast organizing and the kinds of protests and the savvy use of social media to publicize these protests that these workers have made. I think it's really important to say that protesting in this day and age is very different than protesting was even 10, 12 years ago, right? Was something between 10 and 15 million people protested around the world before the start of the first Gulf War. The second Gulf War, 2003. But there was very little coverage of it, right? Now people publicize their own events, right? I've watched people post videos of protests onto social media and messages and download images of protests in other parts of the world. It's a new era. So all of this gives me hope, but I think also there's something about the poverty wages that so many people are laboring under today that's soul crushing, and the kinds of disrespect. I think it's really crucial that many of the organizations that I looked at are called Respect. In the Philippines, the Fast Food Workers Union is called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. The Walmart Workers Organization in this country is called Organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart. I saw this again and again everywhere I went, and I think workers are giving themselves that respect. They're earning that respect by winning concessions. Some of them are huge. I mean, the fact that they won this huge increase in the minimum wage in the states of New York and California, the two biggest labor markets in the U.S., that's huge. Is it enough? By no means. As LaFonza Butler, who's one of the union organizers who was the co-chair of the Living Wage campaign in L.A., said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year, even if you work full time. But if you win it for yourself, you get a sense of respect and a sense of belief that you can bring change that fuels further action. And I think that's what gives me hope. There is change happening. It's not happening overnight. It's not enough yet, but change is happening, and it's potent and it's powerful. And even the Me Too movement, right? Long before we were hearing from Hollywood actresses, these workers around the world were campaigning for global UN resolutions and International Labor Organization conventions banning sexual violence in the workplace. That's amazing. And if they win it, it will change our world, and it will change individual lives in workplaces, from New York to Cape Town.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Great stuff. Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, we appreciate your time with us, and we do and hope that you can join us again soon.
I hope so. I'd love to talk with you more. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
It's over. Biden's numbers are in the ditch. Democrats are doomed. Call the priest. These are Democrats talking. Even before November's congressional elections are run, many conventional-thinking Democratic operatives are surrendering to a presumed Republican sweep. You don't need a political science degree to know that if you start out announcing that you'll lose, chances are you will. After all, who wants to vote for a party that shows no fighting spirit, no confidence in the appeal of its own ideas? What's happening here is that the party's top leaders have decided their candidates can't win in rural areas and smaller factory cities, so they've quit trying. Worse, they blame the voters, claiming that Trumpism, Fox News BS, and culture war nonsense have poisoned the minds of people, quote, out there. Thus, party leaders have retreated from the countryside to focus entirely on big urban areas. Democratic congressional leaders even killed killed their rural outreach programs, and the party's chairman in 2018 meekly declared, "You can't door knock in rural America." Actually, sir, you can. And if you choose to abandon this working-class constituency, surprise, it will abandon you. Worse than failing to campaign along America's dirt roads and factory streets, National Democrats have actively been pushing corporate policies that have ravaged families living there, including trade scams sucking out union jobs, shamefully bailing out Wall Street bankers who crashed our real economy while ignoring millions of devastated workaday people, and doing nothing about the corporate-caused farm depression still ripping across our land. Washington Democrats have largely betrayed this vital constituency. This is Jim Hightower saying, did party poobahs think voters wouldn't notice or care how they're being treated? If we want them back on our side, then let's go to them and get back on their side. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Elizabeth Lower-Basch, who's director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you so much for having me to talk about this important topic.
Absolutely, and it is our pleasure. You know, with his sights on overhauling the nation's safety net, President Trump has opened the door to new orders that put in place work requirements for people receiving various kinds of federal assistance. First, explain to us what exactly is a work requirement.
Sure. So the basic idea behind the work requirement is that if someone who's receiving some sort of basic need assistance, so that could be cash or food or health care or housing, doesn't work a minimum number of hours or participate in another required activity and doesn't prove that they're working those hours, they can be cut off from receiving those benefits. And in some cases, their family can lose the benefits as well.
Wow. How many of these work requirements have actually been put in place so far? And what kind of benefits are we talking about that are at risk?
So cash assistance under temporary assistance for needy families, which is known by the really awful acronym of TANF, has had work requirements since it was created in 1996. SNAP, or food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is the full official title these days, has work requirements for some populations and has had for decades. But the president and the House Republicans are proposing to expand those requirements to almost everyone who gets food stamps. And they are also approving waiver requests from states that want to impose work requirements as a condition of getting health care under the Medicaid program. And finally, most recently, we're hearing proposals to apply work requirements in housing programs. So it's really showing up all over the place.
I was going to say, I mean, that's covering a huge amount of that population that needs this assistance. In understanding what doesn't work with work requirements, let's start with some of the core assumptions. What are the stereotypes embedded in these programs?
Well, the first stereotype behind the work requirements is that people who are participating in these programs are not currently working. And certainly for both SNAP and Medicaid, a large share of the working age population in these programs are working. And it's just that they are in jobs that either don't provide health insurance or don't pay enough for them to feed their families. So that's the first big stereotype. The second big stereotype is that people don't want to work, that if they're not working, that they need to be forced to work. Whereas the reality is that overwhelmingly people do want to work, but are struggling with other things that are preventing them from doing so.
We're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy here today on americasdemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we already have data that shows the impact of mandatory work programs. First of all, what type of effect do we see on employment and earnings?
So the basic answer is we see very little effect on earnings and really on employment either. People are often able to find low-wage jobs on their own, and that's really what happens when they participate in these programs. Some people find jobs, but most of them would have been able to find jobs even if they hadn't had these requirements. The reality of low-wage work is that people move in and out of jobs, and when they're out of work is when they're most likely to apply for help. And so even if you did absolutely nothing, you would see more people moving into the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Who are the people most affected by these requirements?
Well, it's really pretty much everyone. People who are quite likely to not be able to comply with the requirements include people who might have a work limitation, a disability, but that doesn't qualify them for disability benefits. All the programs sort of say, oh, well, we're only going to apply this to people who are able to work, but we know from TANF and SNAP, which have had work requirements, that many people with disabilities do lose benefits. Also, people who can't find work for other reasons. We know people who are returning citizens who have been, previous histories of incarceration often find it incredibly difficult to find jobs. People don't want to take a chance on them, and this would just be another blow, keeping them out of getting benefits. And finally, we know that people who are working are going to lose benefits from these requirements because they won't be able to keep up with the paperwork to track their hours.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's amazing to me is you have so many people that are working multiple jobs, but because they have perhaps no education or for whatever reason, they're very low-level paying jobs. They've got two jobs. They still can't afford to support their family, and they're affected by this. And it just, something's wrong with a system like that. You know, you argue that work requirements show a profound misunderstanding of the realities of low-wage jobs. Can you expand on that for us, please?
Sure. It's just what we were saying, that, people are often patching together multiple jobs. There's a lot of unpredictable scheduling where you might not know until Sunday night which days you're going to be working. And if you don't keep your schedule free for those hours of work, you might not get any hours scheduled. So the idea that someone can just say, oh, well, I'm only working 15 hours this week, I'll just go to my boss and tell them I need to have 20 hours every week is just unfortunately not the way the labor market works. And
we're in a gig economy, so there are only going to be more people that are affected in that regard, where you don't know when your next day of work is coming.
Right, and sort of the whole paperwork we're thinking about how if you're self-employed and maybe you're starting off and you're not turning a profit yet, and whether people will get credit for that. And it's crazy because each of these programs has different rules, is the way they're setting it up. So someone might have 4 different sets of requirements for 4 different programs.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, your research shows that even when some people are meeting their work requirements, they still lose benefits. How does that happen? And what does it tell us about work requirements being enforced.
Right. So this is what I was saying about the paperwork, that many of these proposals suggest that people would have to report their hours of work every month. I know at least one state says you'd have to do it online. So if you live in a place where you don't have access to high-speed internet, or you don't have a computer at home, you might be out of luck having to do, another trip to some place where you can get online to report your hours. And the reality is people's lives are busy, and sometimes they might not submit the paperwork on time. Other times even they do submit the paperwork on time and the caseworker doesn't get to it, or it gets lost in the mail. And we know there's a lot of churning that's created, and that's stressful for the clients, and it also uses up caseworkers' time. There's one study from Minnesota that found that under TANF programs, the caseworkers were literally spending half their time just tracking down hours of participation and not doing any work with the clients that might help them get a better job.
And as you acknowledged earlier, most people who receive public benefits, they do want to work. What would a program look like that actually helped them achieve that goal?
Right. So there's, I think, two pieces of it. One is sometimes what you really need is job creation and subsidized employment programs. Those have gotten a lot more attention at the national scale in the last year than they've been recently discussed. But we actually have an example from something that was called the TANF Emergency Fund that was created as part of the Recovery Act in 2010. And 39 states used some of the funds under that to create subsidized employment programs for people who really wanted to work and couldn't find jobs. And these are states of Democratic governors, states of Republican governors. It was wildly popular. So that's one real opportunity. And then the other piece is education and training. And as you said, the best predictor of employment is having credentials and skills that are valued in the labor force. And so programs that actually help people get those skills and credentials can make a real difference.
Except there's not enough, it seems to me anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there just doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on those couple of things that you just mentioned. And I don't understand why we keep tearing away at education when we all know that a better education is exactly what you need to survive.
Right, and that's one of the things that's been incredibly frustrating, as I said, under TANF, cash assistance, which has had work requirements for 20 years, is that people don't really get credit for that, for going to college on an ongoing basis. That they have to somehow struggle to combine parenting and going to school and working in order to keep getting the tiny amount of cash that they can get under TANF. So it's really counterproductive to long-term self-security.
Just amazing. Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we do appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Am I correct in thinking it's even worse today than it was 10 years ago?
Oh, yes. And, I sometimes joke, Bill, that a year after we did that book, we did a paperback edition, and I convinced the publisher to change the title to It's Even Worse Than It Was. And then I would say to people, if we had to do a sequel, it might be Run for Your Lives. And we're getting dangerously close to that point. When we wrote that book, we knew that the Republican Party was in a very bad place. We called it an insurgent outlier, noted that the party had become contemptuous of facts and science and of the regular order. But I never thought that it would turn as quickly as it has into, in effect, a cult. And it's almost akin to a fanatic religious cult. And when you get into a situation where the same day that there was a violent invasion of the Capitol, putting the lives of members, not to mention the vice president, at stake, the place was trashed. They left and came back, the members of the Congress, a few hours later, and 2/3 of House Republicans still voted that the election had been illegitimate, that Joe Biden had not won. That's behavior by a cult. And in effect, there are two kinds of people. There are the fanatics themselves who believe all of this stuff and believe that there was massive voter fraud. And then there are the cowards, the ones Liz Cheney has said, and I believe her, that a very large number of her colleagues came up to her and said, "We're with you, but we can't do it publicly." And that's where we are. And it's, of course, not just in Washington. It's even worse in many ways in state legislatures and out in the public as a whole. We still have a majority of Republicans who believe that Joe Biden was not elected legitimately. We're in a bad place right now. And one of the elements here, really, Bill, is that we can't function as a democracy if we don't have two problem-solving parties who believe in the legitimacy of the political system. And we don't right now. And of course, the danger to the fundamental fabric of our political system is dire.
Well, that's one thing you made clear 10 years ago, that people who say, well, both parties are to blame, both parties are bad, neither party is wanting to get things done, whatever. You refute that and give a lot of evidence against it. You did 10 years ago, talking about the Congress. It's even more so today, right? I mean, that most of the blame has to be laid at the feet of the Republican Party, particularly the Trump Republican Party.
Absolutely. And, it's not, I wouldn't say that, we have one side that is a covey of angels and the other side
Right.
that's all bad. There are no angels here. Politics, as you know, as well as anybody, ain't beanbag. It's a tough business. But the contrast between the parties at this point could not be stronger. One of the great frustrations that I have is how much the powerful mainstream media, the major newspapers, the television networks, are willfully blind to this, continue to pursue this as if it were a both sides narrative. And what James Fallows originally coined as false equivalence continues to be more the norm than the exception. And that means that Americans do not know, very large numbers of them, what the reality is and what the danger is to the system. And we see that, frankly, in the surveys that show how many people are willing to vote Republican the next time. Not to realize what it would mean to have a country hamstrung by the Jim Jordans and Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, or the Ron Johnsons, is as much as anything the fault of media that just refuse to call it as reality says it should be.
I have to tell you, it frustrates me too. I mean, to see coverage of something like a former president, right, who calls the current president illegitimate, insists the election was stolen from him, or to see stories like state legislatures passing bills. It's not just another bill. It's a bill that would undermine the democratic system, put people in charge with the authority to overturn an election if they don't like the outcome. And it's reported as just another day in the park.
It's also, the extremism that we're seeing out there. State legislatures that are moving forward and governors willing to sign the bills that would make illegitimate all abortions, including ectopic pregnancies where you have a fetus that isn't viable in the first place, but the mother will surely die. And they call themselves pro-life and continue to be characterized that way more broadly. To see in the aftermath of Uvalde and these other massacres, bills moving forward to have concealed carry handguns for teachers, to double down on some of the worst elements of what we have in our loose gun laws, to see 2 Trump nominated and Senate confirmed judges in the Ninth Circuit invalidate a California law that said that minors could not get access to weapons of war like AR-15s. And that's not a top-level story, that we're not seeing what direction people want to move in. I'll mention one other thing. CPAC, which is really the cutting edge for these right-wing forces, held its annual meeting in Hungary. In Hungary, and all with the purpose of giving awards and laudatory approval to Viktor Orban. This is a group of people who want an autocracy. To see the governor of Florida block a grant to the Tampa Bay Rays because they did some tweets that were critical of his policies, that's Viktor Orban. That's a more pernicious version of Donald Trump in Ron DeSantis.
Well, right. And look what he did for Disney as well, right? Disney dared criticize a bill that he signed, rightfully so.
Every one of these Republican presidential wannabes who may or may not run against Trump, but some of them will. DeSantis, Hawley, Cruz, who's just despicable, and you look at the way he's reacted to the Uvalde massacre. Cotton, Kristi Noem, all of them are basically going to run as, I'm just like Donald Trump, except I'm younger, thinner, and meaner.
Right. Yeah, I'm just like Donald Trump, except I'm not Trump, right? So are we hopelessly divided? I mean, do you see any way out?
It's very tough to find a good path. One thing I would say is, if somehow we got a miraculous turnaround and Democrats held on to the House and Senate, if, for example, the public reaction against the Roe v. Wade decision, assuming that draft brief is close to the final product, if the reaction after all of these continuing massacres using these weapons of mass destruction out there activates voters, suburban voters, a Democratic base, if the January 6th hearings jolt people into realizing that we really do have a fundamental choice between autocracy and democracy, and Republican hopes of winning the House and Senate fail, that may give traction to the Liz Cheney wing of the Republican Party, small as it is, to make them rethink where they are. If instead they win the House and or the Senate, we're headed for very bad times. And I don't see much out there in the country that's there to pull people together. It's a tragedy.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.